Well, welcome everyone. And it is good to see you as we're getting together for our third webinar as the Presbytery of San Fernando. I want to start by saying congratulations on making it through our first virtual Palm Sunday. And it's great to have you here as we start this week leading up to Easter. I know that you are busy, but I appreciate you giving the time to this. And my goal is to give you a bit of inspiration and a bit of refreshment by telling you a story, a really good and a really ancient story. But before we get started, I'd like us just to take a moment, and if you'll open up the chat bar on the side of the Zoom frame that you have there, tell us your name, your church, and just a word that describes how you're doing. And I will share that with the whole group with what I see there. So let's see who we've got here with us today. Well, and so people are starting to type in, and let's see who we've got. We got Paul Clairville, who is warning me to get off of the freeway. I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. Ken's with us. Tim Beal is here, and he said it's going as well as can be expected at this time at St. James. Hendrik is with us again. Hendrik, good to see you again. Mike Harbert is here with us. And Mike, great to have you. And this whole COVID-19 thing is becoming more and more disconcerting to Mike. Leland Long's here from Horizon. Great to have you. And then Hendrik just says that they're doing fine and staying busy. And boy, isn't that the truth? I don't know. I hear about people that are streaming Netflix, but personally, I've barely got time to do that. There's just so many different things that are going on right now. So let's go on and begin with our time together. We're going to start just with a little bit of an introduction before we talk together and then do some interaction. So let me just begin with sharing a slide with you. And let's make sure that this technology is going to work. It looks like it's going okay. One second, and here we go. In a scene from the 1987 film Moonstruck, the extended family is in a tense silence around the table after an unresolved family argument. And the grandfather says, with profound wisdom, "Someone tell a joke." And we find ourselves in such a tense moment in our own lives. We've been told that the next week or two may be the most dramatic week of this COVID-19 crisis, maybe the most dramatic week of our lives. And this grandfather's counsel is as wise for us today as it was for his family in that movie. We all need a reason to laugh so that we can break the tension that surrounds us and open our minds and hearts to new possibilities, to what God is doing in our midst. And we have just such an opportunity for that kind of healthy laughter if we look together at the book of Jonah. And that's the focus of today's virtual meetup webinar. Now, again, I apologize, just getting the technology situated here. We're going to get this right. I'll tell you what we're doing in case you all are interested, just because there's this stall here anyway, which is that I'm working off of a double screen, and the second screen is where the slides are so that I can continue to work off of Zoom. So let me try this again. There we go. So what we're going to do is in the first half of our time together, I'm going to tell the story of Jonah, but in a way that really connects with what we're experiencing in our time right now. And while I'm sharing, feel free to ask questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So take a moment now to look for that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. There you can type in questions. You should be able to start right now, different questions. And following the content part of this, I will then go back to those questions and answer some of the questions that you've had as we talk together about this. Let me also say that there's going to be a PDF with additional content on today's theme that's going to come to you, as well as a video of this webinar, because my hope is that all of this content will help inspire and encourage and refresh you as you lead yourself and your family and the ministry that we're called to in this crazy time in which we find ourselves. So those are the things we're going to be doing together today as we talk in this webinar. So let me just go on and start with Jonah. Many of us are familiar with Jonah, but let me just give you a little overview. Jonah is a little book between Obadiah and Micah, that road less traveled of the minor prophets in our Bible. It's only 4 short chapters long. It's actually the 10th shortest book of the Bible of the 66 different books that make up the Bible. And on one side, you have Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, prophets who often found themselves at odds with their people's perspective and their way of life. And on the other side of Jonah, you have prophets like Micah, Habakkuk, and Nahum. And it's interesting to note that Nahum is one that proclaims God's judgment on the oppression, cruelty, idolatry, and wickedness of Nineveh. That's the actual people that Jonah ends up being in relationship with as well. But in contrast to prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Jonah actually embodies the national and religious ethnocentrism, which sees God as the exclusive property of his own people. Jonah and the way of life that he represents, and this is the key connection point with us, Jonah and the way of life that he represents is going to clash with the way of life of his God. Now, Rabbi Ed Feinstein, who is the senior rabbi of Valley Beth Shalom in the city of Encino, summarized Jonah in this interesting way. He said, "Then one day God appeared to Jonah and shattered his world. In God, there is a unity beneath the divisions, wholeness behind disjunction. You and me, us and them, ours and theirs. Though separated on the surface, we are deeply connected within. The boundaries of self, God insists, must include the other." Now, this point of contact for us and the book of Jonah, maybe you already sensed it in that quote, because we've been pushed apart from one another, and yet it seems like we're being pushed apart from one another in a way that actually brings us closer together. And if we think about it, our world is being stressed, if not shattered, but through the cracks that are happening in our way of life, we're finding another more profound world, which will in fact continue on no matter what. And that's what Jonah is all about. Jonah is trying to highlight this clash between worlds, but showing that the world that's underneath the surface is actually a world that is the world that we all long for, a world of mercy and forgiveness, a world that is our home. It's the world that we need to cling to at this time. It's the world that one day will in fact be all in all. This clash between worlds embodied by the book of Jonah and the world of God's mercy and forgiveness means that, surprisingly for the Bible reader, Jonah is actually our anti-hero. There are at least 4 people in the Bible. I don't know if you've thought about this, but there are at least 4 people in the Bible whose words should never be quoted to support your point. They are Job's friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, who, by the way, is one of the shortest men in the Bible, and Zophar the Naamathite. Those are 3 of them. The other that you should not quote is the prophet Jonah. Listen to how Gerhard von Rad describes Jonah. He says, "This ridiculous, stubborn Jonah, grudging God's mercy to the heathen, but filled with joy at the shade of a castor oil plant, and then wanting to die when he sees it withering away. He is the focal point of the book of Jonah. Now, Jonah, if we think about it, can be easily divided into 4 different sections. We're going to find a basic outline, and here it is. Jonah 1 through 16 is Jonah trying to protect his way of life, his point of view, by escaping God's way of life. That is the way of grace and mercy. Jonah 1:17 to 2:10 is, we could say, that God's way swallows Jonah's way. Then in Jonah chapter 3, Jonah's ministry succeeds as a part of God's way of life. And in Jonah 4, we see that Jonah's way of life fails. That Jonah's way of life fails. So let's follow this structure of Jonah's life as we talk together, and as we reflect upon our own situation, our own lives in LA during the time of the coronavirus. You see, like Jonah, our way of life was headed in a definite direction. I mean, think about it. It was a direction in which we had increased prosperity, low unemployment rates, but don't forget this part, but we were also had deeper divisions between ourselves and more radical positions that we were taking on the right and on the left. Not to mention the fact that it looked very clear like we were going to have 4 more years of being led by septuagenarians of one kind or another. That was the path that we were on. And our church involvement was also continuing to decline. And we were sailing with strong winds in this direction, and nothing seemed likely to stop us. Well, Jonah was on his way. Maybe he was more rebellious. We just kind of got hit by this thing, not through war or anything, but by this virus that has just totally impacted our lives. Jonah had more of a decision. Jonah made a bigger choice, but he was well on his way to Tarshish, and a storm hit. And it says in Jonah 1:4, such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds very familiar to me. Verse 5, Jonah continues, all the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. You see, Jonah's storm had a massive economic implication as well. And certainly ours has. I mean, our storm isn't a physical storm, it's a viral storm called COVID-19. And it was the perfect storm to threaten our entire way of life. We've seen as much, according to the Wall Street Journal, as $10 trillion erased from our markets. And the future way of life for us is unclear. But whatever happens, it's increasingly clear that our way of life will not simply continue as it did before. And we were just talking about this in a presbytery staff meeting, because this is as true for our presbytery as it is for our nation. As a presbytery, we knew that we had a challenge before us before the coronavirus, and that's why we accepted the Logan Report and started out in a new direction, a strategic direction for a new future together. But even now, assumptions that we didn't know that we had. We knew we had problems, but now assumptions we didn't even know we had have been turned upside down. How do you do church over the long haul when you can't actually be physically present with each other? Well, in our wildest dreams, we never imagined that would be the challenge before us. And yet here we are trying to do worship together while we stay in our homes, trying to provide pastoral care to other people without physical presence, trying to run a church without rental or preschool income. And this looks to continue for the foreseeable future, at least, not that we can see very far into the future anyway. Jonah's future was actually thrown overboard. That is, Jonah, the embodiment of a particular way of seeing the world, is thrown overboard in the story. And many of us feel as though our lives have been thrown overboard. We find ourselves in the ebb and flow of our emotions. When sorrows like sea billows roll, those lyrics from the hymn, "It is well with my soul," have a new relevance for us. And many of us have turned to passages from the Psalms to swim through this full range of emotions that we're experiencing. And this is critical, but at some point, we need to add this quirky little book of Jonah from the Hebrew Testament to our reading. It can give us our sea legs as we go through the continuing tempest. And it does so like the best of medicines, with a sugar coating which enables us to swallow it with an ever so loving laugh at ourselves as we cling to our eroding way of life in the face of the future which is unknown. That sugar coating surfaces in Jonah 1:17. Listen to this. Jonah 1:17. Again, apologies for the technical issues, but we're going to get this. Now the Lord, it says in Jonah 1:17, the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. The Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah? A rather strange view of God's providence, no? And yet the experience of being swallowed whole is not far from our own lives. Look at that artwork. Some of us feel like that in the face of the coronavirus. One virtual pastor that I listened to a couple of weeks ago called this time where we're in our homes so much, he called this our cave time. As we're stuck in our homes, he said, it's a time for us to reflect upon God and our lives in a way that we could never do in our businesses, or in our busyness, sorry. Jonah finds the 3 days in the fish to actually be that kind of cave time, that kind of time where he can reflect on God. And he begins to really pray in a manner that sounds an awful lot like the Psalms. Listen to what Jonah says in chapter 2. He prays, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. As I read those words, I'm reminded of what I think a lot of us have already seen as kind of among ourselves. On the Thursday roundtable Zoom meeting for PSF strategy, for example, a number of people shared about how the coronavirus is forcing us to a simpler, more basic, and yet more profound way of life. People have rediscovered family, rediscovered home, rediscovered relationships. And again, being pushed apart physically seems to have brought us together more deeply in certain kinds of ways. There's a redemptive work of God in the middle of this. But getting back to Jonah, we need to remember that this is not just a temporary time where we turn to God and then God will, once this is over, get us back to living the lives that we've always had before. This is not the situation that we're in. This isn't a minor cold that our world has. This is a serious virus. And it has exposed the limitations and weaknesses of our way of life. But as that way of life is kind of cracked apart, it's like there's an opening that gives us a clearer view of a deeper and more profound nature of reality. The underneath the surface of the life that we lead, there's this reality of God's mercy and forgiveness. And what we need in this time is for God to not to reinforce our views and perspectives that we had pre-coronavirus, but to actually change our way of life in the light of a fresh reflection upon God. What we read in Jonah is that Jonah's psalm-like prayer actually starts to sound a little bit too much like Jonah. Look at what he says here in this next slide. Those who clung to worthless idols, he prays. Those who clung to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. And here's where Jonah starts to show up. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation will come from the Lord. Now, do you hear that? Do you hear the self-righteousness that's in the midst of this? And what we need to be careful of is that we don't, in this time, decide to just reinforce the ways of life that we've been leading, the whole way of being church and being people in this time, because this time has changed things, I think, forever. And we're starting a new and a fresh chapter. And in that new and fresh chapter, we need to go back to the real world, the world of God's mercy and love that's consistent and strong and will last forever and ever. And we need to reintegrate that mercy and forgiveness into our own lives. Otherwise, we may find ourselves just falling back into old habits once this is over, just falling into back habits of how we used to live. But this is about something becoming completely new. Jonah continues in chapter 2, verse 10. This is probably one of my favorite verses in the Bible. The Lord commanded the fish, it says in 2 verse 10, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Wow. Now, as you can guess, artists have had a field day with that that concept, that idea of Jonah being vomited out onto this land in Nineveh. Let me show you one of them, but if you Google that, if you go on and Google that, that alone, just Jonah vomited onto dry land, you're going to find multiple images that will actually show up. And here's one of them that's a little less graphic, but one of them that nonetheless has this image of Jonah being spit out forcefully from a fish and then ending up among the people that he didn't want to be among in the first place, in the way of life he never wanted to truly engage. And brothers and sisters, when this is all over, one way or another, and excuse, the graphic words, but I'm just speaking the Bible here. When this is over, we are going to be vomited up into a new land. Let me explain what I mean by that term. Think of what it's going to be like when this is over. We don't know when it's going to be over, but just imagine what it's going to be like when all of this is over. It's going to be messy, isn't it? I mean, it's going to be a new world in which we all have to find our new way of being. You know that people are going to be fighting over who gets to set the rules in the new world. That's already happening now. And you know that once that's determined, we're going to have to learn new ways to follow the new rules in order to be okay in life. We're going to have to integrate this new way of being, whatever it is, into our new rhythm of life. And so the challenge before us is, will we be ready to take this challenge on when we're spit up upon the beach in this new land? Or will we just continue to hold to the false expectation that our pre-COVID-19 way of life and way of doing church is going to hold, that actually we were right all along, that things should go back to whatever it was that we wanted them to be on whichever side of the political and ideological and theological arguments that we set ourselves on? What I'm arguing here is that this is a massive reset and that we need to start afresh and start anew with the core of our faith, the mercy and the forgiveness of God. Because one thing we see as we follow Jonah's story is that God's story will win out. That grace, forgiveness, mercy will win out no matter what happens. And that what this may actually mean is that our way of life, the way of life that we knew pre-COVID-19, will lose out. Because this is exactly what happened to Jonah. Jonah experienced the loss of his life when he followed the path that God had for him in Nineveh. Take a look at this next slide. When God saw how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction that he had threatened. You see, when God showed mercy and grace to the people of Nineveh, you know what that meant? That meant that Jonah's whole perspective on life failed, that all that he had prayed in his psalm-like prayer was no longer true, that God was willing to forgive idolatrous and oppressive and violent people that Jonah hated. Suddenly, his way of life failed, and God's way of mercy and forgiveness prevailed. And to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became very angry. So the question is, how will we respond once this is all over? And this is where rethinking the church comes in. This is where we need to get back to the core of the gospel, the core of the message, the story of God, and begin to reshape our church ministry around that core. Because that's who God is calling us to be, as we talked about last week. We have to be clear on what God's calling us to do, reshape ourselves in this time of crisis around the core, and begin to move forward in a new way. You see, something we Western Christians have forgotten is that God's story is a story where you win by losing. We see this in the life of Jesus. It was reflected in his triumphal entry on Palm Sunday with the palm leaves and the praises of the people, huge fame that any celebrity today would love. But then from what we just reflected on to next Sunday, Easter Sunday, we find that all of that adulation fell apart and turned to condemnation, that Jesus failed to build on that Palm Sunday praise and instead was crucified, dead, and buried. But the news of the gospel is that failure in the eyes of the human world was actually huge success in God's way of mercy and forgiveness. God's story of mercy and forgiveness prevailed even in the quote-unquote failure of Jesus' ministry. It was Jesus' success through failure that paralleled the story of Jonah, because Jonah succeeded through failure as well. And this is why Jesus calls his own ministry in Matthew 12 a sign of Jonah. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is the story of God's mercy and forgiveness taking preeminence as the story that drives reality. Through faith in Christ, that story becomes the script from which we live our own lives. Because in Christ, it is possible for us to show authentic mercy and real forgiveness to others out of gratitude, because we have been shown mercy and forgiveness through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But to walk down that path, to live our lives around that story, means that we will lose our lives. What is it that Jesus said was required of his disciples? That they lay down their life, take up their cross, and follow him. Now, some of you may have been wondering, who is this person that's in this slide of Jonah? Well, it's not Jonah, I can tell you that. It's William Seymour. And this is a man that came to Los Angeles in 1906. And he had an amazing dream, a beautiful dream. As he wrote it once, his dream was that our colored brethren would love our white brethren and respect them in truth, so that the word of God can have its free course, and that our white brethren must love their colored brethren and respect them in truth, so that the Holy Spirit won't be grieved. He said, I hope we won't have any more trouble and division of spirit. It was quite a dream. But he, when he arrived in Los Angeles with this dream, with this vision, was locked out of his first church in Los Angeles. Then his church became multi-ethnic, but it never grew very large, never would be successful according to our church metrics. And then as he continued on in his ministry, he found division, even in the midst of success, among his people. And after he passed away, his wife took over leadership of the church, but then an Anglo man came in and began to struggle with her over leadership, and ended up taking over, or actually splitting the church into two among ethnic lines. And the sad thing is that the church building itself, the LA sheriff had to come in and shut it down because of the way where people were treating one another, and ended up having to actually just sell the building and hand out the proceeds for that. The crazy thing, though, is that as you look at his life and look at his dream, it didn't happen for him in Los Angeles. But here's the thing. Seymour was a part of a much bigger dream that God had, far bigger than he had imagined. Because Seymour's ministry resulted in something many of you have heard called the Azusa Street Revival, which was the key to the global Pentecostal movement, which is the largest movement of Christians in the world today. Seymour, who was a very humble man, experienced the disappointment of his own ministry and his own life, and he never saw what God would do through him. Incredible things that God would do globally through this man's ministry. And Jesus told us as much, didn't he? What was it that he said in some of the most radical countercultural words of the scriptures? It's from the Beatitudes. He said this, the meek shall inherit the earth. Brothers and sisters, God's way will win. His way will win. And if we join in his way, we will be fruitful. And this is the challenge of the book of Jonah. This is the challenge we find ourselves in today. Are we willing to let go of our way of life? Are we willing to instead reintegrate the mercy and the forgiveness of God, God's story, into our lives in a way that goes deeper than we've ever done that before? Is that what we will choose? Or will we choose to be like Jonah, who, let me show you one more slide on this, to be like Jonah, which in Jonah 4:1, these sad words say, but to Jonah, this seemed very wrong. All of God's forgiveness and mercy seemed very wrong, and he became angry. So what is it that we'll choose? What will we choose? There's this medieval homily that I just dearly love, and it adds an ending to the book of Jonah. And this is the ending that I pray will be true for all of us in this difficult time. Here's what it says. At that very moment, Jonah fell flat on his face, saying, direct the world according to the attribute of mercy, as it is written, mercy and forgiveness belong to the Lord. And I say amen to that, brothers and sisters, because we have all sorts of challenges in front of us. We don't know what's going to happen to our own world. We're not sure what's next. But here's the thing that we can be sure of. That is that God's mercy, that God's forgiveness, that story that God is writing in human history will continue forward, and we can continue to be a part of it, and we will find success in that, no matter what. And if we cling to that and don't resist wherever this is leading us, if instead we engage and move forward and continue in the confidence of the forgiveness and mercy that we have in Jesus Christ, we will bear much fruit, and there will be all sorts of things that God has for us in the future. So do not fear, brothers and sisters. We're in this together, and we are going to follow God's calling into the future that he has for us. So thank you for listening and this sharing from God's word. I hope that this is something that has been inspiring to you as it's been inspiring to me as I've been working on this. What I'd ask is if you want to use the Q&A bar again at the bottom of the Zoom frame and go on and type in your questions, then I'm able to see those questions and I can respond. For example, Mike Harbert has already set a couple of questions that he'd just like all of us to ponder. And so let me go on and answer those questions. And they are this: what might God be calling us to in this current reality as church leaders? Reflecting on Jonah, reflecting on our experience, what is it that God's calling us to in this current reality? And the second question he'd like us to ponder is, in what ways might we be resistant to being truly open to God's invitation at this time? And I can just kick off an answer to that one by saying the resistance I've seen is the fact that I didn't want to let go of kind of the rhythm of life that I had just a few weeks ago. And I was trying to adapt it and hold on to everything that I could. But what I found as being far more helpful and fruitful in this time is instead to let go of all of that and start afresh in terms of what my life, what my week, what my day is going to be like, and do that again with an emphasis on my relationship with God. I just wonder if there are any other questions that people would like to ask. Let me take a look on the participant bar or the chat bar too, because that's been a bit difficult. And let me just stop sharing for a moment here as well, if I need to do that. No, we're good. Anything else that you would like to ask at this point? Maybe you just want to ponder it, and that's totally fine. This Q&A part is kind of icing on the cake for this time together. Leland Long says, thank you for the blessing of this message. Leland, thank you. I'm glad that it's a blessing for you, because that's the intent here. Let me just take a moment to remind you too that on Thursday, we're going to have a Zoom meeting as we normally do at 4 p.m. You'll receive an invitation to that. But that Zoom meeting is going to be focused primarily on sharing together and praying together. That's very much a time to get together and talk and dialogue and pray for and with one another. Let's see, we've gotten a few more questions at this point from Bob. Bob Cox says, how do we validate new practices and processes as being godly and not deflections from Satan? And I think that's a critical question. We need to make sure that we keep our eye on the core of who we are as the people of God. And that's why one of the reasons I've encouraged reflection on Jonah is that Jonah got off track because Jonah began to believe that the forgiveness and mercy of God was strictly for his people who think in his way. What we need to get back to and always hold at the core is that amazing forgiveness and mercy of God. If we keep that at the middle of the new practices that we're doing, if these are practices that further that grace of God, then we're on the right track. We cannot go wrong in that sense. A book that I'd encourage you to look at, since we seem to have some extra time at home, is What's So Amazing About Grace by Philip Yancey. I think that's a book that challenged me on the grace of God, on the core of that part of the gospel, and I think that would be helpful as well. Let's see, Joyce has a couple of questions for us. Joyce has asked, how do you think we will change the life of the church? Now, that's a good one, and that's actually something that in the staff presbytery meeting just about 2 hours ago, we were talking about, just beginning that conversation. It's something we're going to talk a lot about, but one of the things that we talked about is that on the one hand, we've got people that aren't really able to enter into this virtual world that's being created right now. On the other hand, we had a lot of people that weren't able to engage our traditional worship services. That was a big part of our decline. And so what we need to do, first of all, is to take the tension between the creative virtual stuff that's going on. That's amazing. There's incredible stories of what's happening, but we need to combine that also with the folks that can't engage that and are more used to the traditional services. And we have to figure out between the two, who do we need to be? How do we do this? Again, it goes back to the core of Jonah, where we're talking about the grace of God. We're talking about the mercy and forgiveness of God. How do we as the church extend the mercy and forgiveness of God to everyone? Now, just a couple other things that I'll add to that question is what I do see in the future is that suddenly physical space and physical presence is going to be different. You know, what we were as a presbytery before, and this isn't an accurate way to put it, but it's an interesting way to think of it, is that we were a presbytery with a portfolio of 26 different pieces of real estate. Those churches, those physical churches, were really central to our understanding of who we were. Now, that was already starting to change some with cyclical and with churches that would either move around or where they wouldn't own the building, and yet those churches would grow and develop. But now in this case, we're finding that virtual churches, there's a lot of possibilities there. And yeah, there are pitfalls to it as well. I'm not saying they're the grand solution. But what we're starting to see is that physical location is starting to change in terms of where that is for us. And we're going to have to figure that out. How do we do this together? We're going to have our presbytery meeting in April online, first time ever. I'm trying to figure out, as the head of the worship part of that, how are we going to do communion online? There's some examples out there. Some are better than others, but how's that going to work? So I guess, Joyce, more than anything, I have lots of questions to throw back at you and just some observations. I think it's too early for us to figure that out. But again, keep at the heart of all that we're trying out. The key is extending the mercy and forgiveness of God that we've received in Jesus Christ. And if we find new ways to do that, that's going to give us real clues for how we need to be the church. Just some other things that I'm seeing in the chat bar here. Mike Harbert says, I'm struggling to be truly open to my natural tendencies to just be productive and keep moving instead of sitting with what's truly going on deep inside my soul because of our current reality. And boy, isn't that true? I think, Mike, you're not alone in that. And just, the Thursday Zoom gathering, which Mike led us through a prayer process. And we're just going to continue to have Mike lead us through some prayer processes that enable us to do exactly that, to stop from all the activity, all the strategy, all the trying to move forward, and to take time to just reflect on what's actually going on inside of me. What is God doing inside of me? That's going to be a critical part of making it through this time and really clinging more closely to God through the challenges that we have. He also adds, Mike adds this as well. He says, I'm beginning to realize that I have to build a new foundation for being grounded and healthy and useful for this new normal now and into the future. And that also, I'm with you 100% on that. I think what I'd encourage you to do, though, and this is minor, but this has been helpful to me, is rather than thinking of it as a foundation, kind of like, well, that building collapsed, now I need a new foundation. What I like to think of it as is more like a core, like a web, a core that I need to go back to that core, which is the same core. It's not a new core, it's the same core, but I need to re-engage that core in my thinking. I need to re-engage that core like on Thursdays in our Zoom calls and in my devotional times. And then I need to let God just build out from that again. Do you remember that image of the stump of Jesse that's used? You know, how Israel was massively pruned down to the stump of Jesse, but then there were new shoots, and those of us that are Gentiles are part of those new shoots. That's critical. That's really critical, because those new shoots are going to start to grow and develop in our lives, but we're just being brought back to the core. And so I think as we continue to do that individually and together, those new shoots are going to develop, and God's going to bear much fruit through us. And I think Joanne, by the way, Joanne just said that she really appreciates Mike's comment, and that she sees Jonah's biggest error as speaking when he should have been reverently silent in God's presence, that prayer equals listening. And again, that's part of what we're trying to do, is find that balance by having a Monday event at the beginning of the week that's more focused on content and strategy and things to help us solve what we're struggling with. But then on Thursday is really much more of that time of silence. We actually had times of silence in our prayer together on Thursday, and we're going to continue to do that. So if we can build that kind of balance in our lives, that's going to help us to continue forward in the path that God does have for us. And I want us to know, God has plans for us. We are not off of God's script. We may be off of our script. We're not off of God's script. So let's continue to seek God's face and follow God in that. Well, we have about 10 more minutes, and I would love to continue talking. Oh, John has a question for us. John Bullock says, how do we maintain fellowship in a church model with enforced distance in worship? And that's a great question, John. And that's something that our churches are really struggling with. And again, that also highlights the thing that we talked about in the presbytery staff meeting, which is there are some people that have jumped on to this virtual worship service. And you know what they've actually found? Many of them have had increased numbers in worship. They've actually extended their reach, not only beyond their location or the state or even our country, but they found connections around the world as people are joining them in worship. So that's a bright side. We are seeing that kind of connectedness. And also, I don't know if you've tried this, some of you I know have, but I've had weekly Zoom calls with my parents and in-laws, and we've gathered people together, and we've actually found that we've got some relationship building, some depth of relationship going on as we're in conversation with each other. And it's really going well. I'm not saying it's a substitute for physical presence, but what I am saying is that we can continue to deepen our relationships through these virtual means. However, we've got this problem of the fact that there is a good portion of the population that isn't able to do that. So first thing I'd say is, number one, help them. If you can give them help so that they can make that connection, then spend some time doing that. That is really worth it for them as well. But then let's think about the folks that just aren't able to do that for a whole variety of reasons. That's where we've got to do a lot of thinking. How are we going to engage with them? I can tell you one story, John, from my own experience, which is calling my mom. We tried, Zoom is tough for her, so we tried FaceTime. And then it ended up that most of FaceTime, her hand was moving and we were getting a good picture of her forehead and the ceiling of her place. So then we thought, you know what, let's go back to just regular phone calls. And so we had a group phone call, but my mom also has some hearing issues. And so this last time we called her regular phone call, not on speaker mode, and individually had conversations with her, which she could clearly hear. She was used to that technology. And as a result, she had great conversations with all 4 people in my family. It was a long phone call, but it served its purpose. And so that's a lower tech way that we can engage with other people. Now, none of this answers the bigger question, which is how do we do this in the long haul? But I don't even think we need to go there yet. What we need to do right now is figure out how to deepen our fellowship with one another. And again, I think we can do that in a number of high and low tech ways. So, feel free to share with me by email, randy@randylovejoy.com, some of those ways. And I'd be happy to put those together into the PDFs that are going out to you after these webinars, just to give you some ideas of how to do that. So we ought to share those ideas with one another. Or if you know John or how to contact John Bullock, then send him some thoughts on that as well, as he continues to figure that out in his own church situation. Well, listen, I want you all to know, we just got a few minutes left, and I want you all to know that this has been a good time for me. Thank you for letting me know that what I've shared has been useful to you. We will see you on Thursday, where we will be gathered together there. And I think right near the end of the meeting, David, yeah, go on and share that slide right now. They've seen me long enough, I think. So that just gives you the information on Thursday. And I want you to know that my plan next Monday is to actually have another panelist on this, that we're going to talk together about some of the challenges. And at least what I'm thinking, if I can work this out, is, and I'm going to put the pressure on Nick, so you can all put pressure on him. I want to get Nick Warnes in, and for the 2 of us to interact together around the idea of what are some other income streams that we have, or that we can develop as a congregation, because I know one of the critical needs for so many of our congregations is the rental, and the preschool money is drying up. And Nick, through his work with Cyclical, has a lot of examples, real time, of ways that congregations have developed other income streams that would be helpful to you. So I'm hoping that we can do that next week, and then maybe the week following, we'll go back to the scriptures again and do some more work there. Thanks so much for being with us. Just really appreciate all of you, and may God bless you as you start off this new week and as we go through this Easter week. I think God has a lot to reveal to us as we're really struggling as we go through this time of struggling of Jesus' life, but a struggle, remember, which leads to the resurrection. So just want to just bless all of you with that. And again, you can contact me through email on a regular basis, randy@randylovejoy.com, and I'd be happy to interact with you there. And just want to thank you for all that you've done. So here's the Thursday event again for all of you, and take care and have a great week. Bye.